right, next section. Now we're going to look at some clothes. All right, so what did they wear, right? So although garments, more garments have survived from the 17th century than from the earlier periods that we discussed, works of art still make up the largest percentage, the largest portion of sources that we use for information about garments in the 17th century. So we're going to be looking at some of those garments. And these works include paintings and drawings from masters and also from actual individuals of what they wore and what it looked like in their regular everyday life. In addition, fashion plates, so early fashion magazine type magazines were sent from Paris to other parts of the world, so to France, to Spain, and ultimately to the unformed United States, to the American colonies. So we have those as well, and we do have some brief, written descriptions of those garments as well. So that's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to talk about what did they wear. This period is unique because this is the first time where there actually was a difference in the way that men and women's clothing were conceived and constructed. So we've seen for decades and decades, they essentially were wearing the same thing. And when we talked about the Renaissance last time, we talked about this is the first time there was really a shift. So this is really the first time where men's garments and women's garments were completely different, not just modifications of the same type of garments, but completely different. So, this separation of the creation of garments, profoundly affected both the character and the reputation of fashion, going forward, and still to this day. Interestingly enough, we are moving back towards some androgyny in some things that are being worn, some traditional, in my air quotes, female garments are being co-opted by men and vice versa. So really the production and acquisition of textiles did change in this period. And, gradual improvements in machinery were made. So we talked about, in the last lecture, we talked about some looms that were made and knitting machines that help mass produce stockings. So those inventions continued, and there were some technological advances. That's probably the best way to say it in looms. The other thing that happened is China, instead of just being a Silk Road partner, China opened its borders and started actually sending out its own ambassadors. And in that exchange, that intercultural exchange, when they visited the court of Louis XIV, all of these sumptuous garments were revealed. And of course, the people at court went crazy. They went crazy over them. So, they had been living with the interpretations of these garments, and to see them up close and personal definitely put Versailles fashion all a Twitter. So, they were unaccustomed to seeing some cottons of vibrant hues. They were more accustomed to silks, but the introduction of actual Chinese dignitaries definitely changed what French nobility wanted to, or they wanted to mimic that richness. So, for upper class folks, they actually hired a professional tailor that made clothing to their specifications. So essentially, they started with the fabric and the silhouette. Sometimes when we all start with the silhouette, they started with the fabric, and the tailor was able to create the silhouette. But for lower classes, women of the family still did that work. So we talked about that throughout history, how the women in the family created the garments. They didn't create the textiles, but they did create the garments. At this point, most professional tailors were male. They were considered artisans of the merchant class, and oftentimes they had women that worked for them that did that ornamental and that fine work, so all the decorations. So we look at the image at the image here on the right, you know, there is a tailor that put that crazy. Let's say that crazy. Why? I don't know why anybody want their hips to look that big. That crazy wide garment together, but the ornamentation and the decorative work was done by women. And you know, in 1675, a group of French women, women seamstresses, a group of seamstresses actually applied for the right to work, the right to form a guild of female tailors to make clothes, and they were approved. So yay for the French seamstresses in 1965. So, you know, creating garments was a specialty. It was a skilled task to create something of the level that that the nobility would wear. Okay, had technical difficulty, so I'm stringing these two pieces together. So let's talk about men. What did the men wear? So, you know, we're going to look at the three images on the screen. We're going to start the one in the middle and then work our way out. But really, in this era, the shirt became an actual outer garment. So in the previous eras that we've looked at, the shirt really has been an undergarment, that, you know, that chemise, that linen, that tunic thing that mostly linen, sometimes cotton thing that they wore underneath. Now it becomes part of the ensemble. If we remember, Yvonne kicked in. If we remember back in the Renaissance period, you know, the introduction of the ruff, right? So that was actually an added piece, and the lace collar was an added piece. And in this period, the shirt becomes part of the costume, right? Becomes part of the costume. So it becomes an integral part of the garment. So the whole the shirt was cut very full. It was generally made of white linen, and it had a flat collar, known as a failing band. So if you look at the image here in the middle, he has this flat collar, which is known as the falling band. Okay, and you know, the sleeves and the cuffs were often lacy and frilly. They were, you know, decorated sometimes with cut work, or some kind of, you know, Spanish embroidery or something along those lines. The doublet, right? So the doublet continued to be worn over the shirt, and generally it was laced. You can see the laces here. Generally it was laced, lace clothes at the waistline, and the pant was known as breeches, and they could either be knee length or calf length, and oftentimes they were cut to mimic a dress. So when we look at the image here, sorry, my video is hiding. It's hiding it in the corner. We look at the image here. Actually, those are breeches. They are cut to look more like a dress. You know, in evolving forms, the waistline was either natural or it was very high. So in this image, the waistband is very high, and in this image, it is lower. Again, breeches, the pants, the bottoms were, you know, cut more tapering. So they were tight at the waist and tapered and flared out, and were cut in the image of the skirt. Additionally, you know, for outdoors, men wore capes and cloaks, which generally had wide collars, or they wore a garment, you know, close to this, which is called a cassock, and it is just a coat that is cut wide, has wide full sleeves and a very wide throughout the body, and it actually ended at the thighs or a little below the thighs. As we move later on into the period, the doublet does change a little bit. The doublet becomes a little shorter, so it allows more of the shirt to be shown, and then collars again were either part of the garment or an added piece. And then in this image that we see here, they also wore a lot of cloaks, and the cloaks were called a bag of neck. So they also wore cloaks. In terms of footwear, I just like the name of it. The footwear was known as a slap sole. It was a flat sole that was only attached to the front. So if you see the image here and the image here, it's only attached to the front. And they're called slap soles because they would slap the ground as the wearer walked. So basically it was a flip-flop, but a shoe. And my kids know the pet peeve. I don't want to hear you're flipping and flopping. So that's why they were called a slap sole. Okay? So these are generally what the garments were for men. And if we look at this image here on the right, the black and white image, this is a man dressed in the style that was popular in the later half of this century. And at this time, the breeches were actually called petticoat breeches. And if we remember from the last chapter, the petticoat was a woman's undergarment, but they were called petticoat breeches because they were meant to mimic the style of a dress. It's just a divided skirt, cut full, and it does have its pants. It has the appearance of the skirt, and he has a short jacket on top, and then of course over the top of that he has his cape. So this is generally what men wore, and the image in the middle is where they started at the beginning of the century and where they ended closer to the end of the century. And of course, the images that we've seen of folks at court when they got gussied up, when they got dressed up. So this is a great representation of what men wore in this century. And now it's time for the ladies. So what did the ladies wear? What did they wear? So we have three images. We're going to work our way through each one. And they continue. Remember, a couple slides ago, I talked about this is the first time that there's actually a distinction between what men and women wore, really what they wore and the fabrics that they used. So what did not change for the women was the undergarment. Sorry, my pen's all in the way. What didn't change for the women was their undergarment. They still continued to wear that white linen chemise. These undergarments, the bodies were changed. So instead of them being as flowy as they used to be, they tended to be more fitted, and oftentimes the top and the bottom had a seam at the waist, so you could have some differentiation for the waist. Gowns, for the most part, if you look at all three of these images, for the gowns, they opened at the center front, right here, they opened at the center front, and they had several layers. So if you look at each one of these women, they are wearing layers upon layers. And what's interesting in this period as well is women of all social classes wore garments that were really ostentatious. I hate to say it that way, but that's the reality. The image that we see here on in the middle is actually of an Italian noblewoman, and it's really characteristic of what was happening in Spain for the first couple of decades. Remember, I said Spain was on a different track. Spain was on a different track in part because of its close ties to the Roman to the papacy. So they weren't as ostentatious as the image that we see on the left, which is of a French artist, which painted this image of his wife on her wedding day. So you see, she has layers upon layers of lace and puff sleeves and ribbon, and it looks like she has velvet, brocade, linen, cotton. I mean, she has a whole host of different items there in her costume. Right, her garment is layered upon layers, and in this period, skirts were generally separate garments. So we see both of these actually all three of these images. You can see the differentiation, even though they're the same fabric, that it's a skirt with a top over it, with a top that is over it. And there were, of course, the undergarments were worn as well. Sometimes the undergarment and the outer garment were sewn together. But it's interesting because the outer layers of these garments are called modiste, Modeste. That will be on the page, so you'll back on the tab, you'll get that definition there. And the underlayer was called the secret. And we know both of those words. A secret is S-E-C-R-E-T, French pronunciation. And so we know these two words, right? The goal was to be modest and to keep your secrets and to keep your secrets. So, in addition to what we see here with the two separate pieces, these stylish sleeves, so the image of the woman all the way to the left, all the way to the right, had a series of ties and puffs in their sleeves. Necklines tended to be low. Sometimes they were V-shaped, sometimes they were square. We see them both here. And ruffs in the early part of the period still tended to be stiff, and in the later part of the period, they got flat and soft, which is the image in the middle is the early part, and then you see the last, actually on the right-hand side, we see she's wearing a falling ruff. For outer garments, women wore capes generally, and we're going to talk about some of the accessories we wore in the next slide. So the use of accessories and cosmetics and grooming practices cannot easily be separated amongst the sexes like clothing can be. So we see an image here. It's actually images from the Met Costume Institute in New York City, and this is a pair of women's gloves. But men could have worn these gloves just as well. There is not as much distinction in accessories, and both men and women use the same items, and oftentimes they were selected for fit, not for style. So a man's glove wasn't necessarily that much different than a woman's glove. The same thing for footwear. So gloves are both for men and women were both used. We talked about it earlier in the lecture that oftentimes things were perfumed because people didn't bathe regularly, so the body odor was prevalent, right? So oftentimes gloves and handkerchiefs would be scented with perfumes. Men and women carried both. They were both ornate. Men and women both carried purses to carry their change, to carry their coins, to put their coins in. They did carry purses. Women, more so than men, actually did use fans, but men use fans as well. So really, in this time, very little was different for men and women. Men and women both used fur muffs, which is just something that you put your hands in like that. Put your hands in. They were all. It was very androgynous at this point. The accessories were interchangeable. The garments themselves were very different. The accessories were interchangeable. Jewelry again was prevalent. Men wore chains and pendants and lockets and rings. Women wore all the same things in addition to bracelets and earrings. They also had mirrors. Compacts were created that they carried around their waist with a chain. And then women had what was called a pomander ball, which was just a little ball of perfume. A little ball of perfume. Because again, our sensibilities were under attack. Under attack. Cosmetics were used by men and women. Perfume was applied to all articles and persons of male and female. And cosmetics were, whitening of the skin and rouging of the cheeks and lips. So in this instance, accessories were more unisex than clothing. To finish up with accessories, this table you will see in the lecture. I just wanted to show you some images of of shoes. These, again, are unisex. Both men and women wore these styles. Again, these images are from the Met Costume Institute, and neither of them are identified as male or female. And finishing up here, again, you will see this visual summary, but here's some examples again from the Met. I love looking at this stuff of a man's doublet and the bodice of a woman's dress. Sorry, my notes are down here. And the bodice of a woman's dress. And again, you can see the richness of the fabric and the detail of the adornment. So we're going to finish up there. Go on back to the lecture tab.